Chapter 1. The Cry in the Barn. The storm had broken the heat, but left the plains shivering, and the wind that came afterward carried the mineral smell of wet iron and the faint hum of the old pylons that stitched the sky from horizon to horizon. Elias had been closing the north gate when he heard it, no ordinary bleat or broken ankle moan from the flock, but a voice shaped like language, low and hoarse, and threaded with a pain too proud to be called a plea. He stopped under the eaves of the barn and listened, counting the seconds between the lightning's white bones and the thunder's dark belly, the way a man who'd lived through orbital sirens and ground laser sweeps learns to count whether he means to or not. Again it came, from the lambing stall he used for sick animals and injured drones. Decked with his wife's old blanket and a prayer charm, she'd nodded there in a quieter year. "Just kill me," it said, patient and almost bored, as if death were an overdue chore and not a closing of light. Elias set the latch with his shoulder, wiped his palm on his trousers, and walked toward a future that felt like the pressure before a harvest wind. Inside, the barn was a cathedral of wood and work. Freshly oiled gears hung from pegs, coils of fence wire glinting like halos, rows of feed bags sealed with red wax sigils from the co-op inspector. The lambing stall glowed with the battery lamp he'd left a minute ago, and something inside moved in a careful way that made the hay whisper. He thought of wolves, of broken raptors that sometimes nested among the rusted irrigation towers, of smugglers who had been known to hide under tarps until the searchlight passed, but nothing in his memory matched the weight of that voice. He lifted the crossbar and pushed the door gently, as if the hinges were nerves. The first thing he saw was the blanket, charcoal gray, old army weave, the one he only took down for births and for winter nights when the batteries failed and the animals needed the memory of warmth. The second thing he saw was the claw that held the blanket closed, glossy ebony like obsidian, jointed with velvet sinew, each talon curved in a surgeon's certainty. His body moved without consulting his mind. He staggered back, bumped the feed barrel, and the rattling inside sounded like hard rain on tin. The creature the person stiffened, not out of fear, but in that resigned preparation of someone who expects to be hated and intends to bear it with dignity. "You can fetch the scattergun if it helps," the voice said from beneath the blanket, not from a human mouth, but through a throat built for something older. "But do it quick. They put a beacon in me." He could have run for the scattergun, could have shouted for Finna down at the mill, could have slammed the barn doors and cinched them with chain and prayed to any god that still answered in this century. But the angle of the talon on the blanket wasn't begging or threatening. It was just holding itself together. Elias took one step forward, then another, until he was near enough to smell what the storm had washed onto the creature's skin: cold stone, pine pitch, a strange metallic sweetness like the breath of solar panels after dawn. He set his hand, slow as a sunrise, on the blanket's edge. "I'm going to look," he said, and something inside him, something left over from the years when he wore a ship's patch and spoke in coordinates rather than hedgerows, unfolded an old calm that had saved his friends more than once. He peeled back the blanket. The horror wasn't blood or bone, though there were wounds and the kind of burn that eats rather than sears. The horror was the lattice, thin, pearly strands threaded through flesh and scale, wrapping the thorax in a net of pale fire that shivered with subsonic tones. Four jewel-like nodes were fastened to it, fluttering like tiny transparent hearts, and a fifth, larger than a goose egg, pulsed with a rhythm that felt wrong to both man and barn. The dragon for Elias finally allowed the syllables to settle in his head like a stone in a brook, held his eyes, molten gold pocketed with soot flecks, and did not look at the net. "Hunter's mercy," the dragon said, which was what the Pale Riders called it when they seeded a beacon in prey, tuned to scream across the spectrum to any licensed ship within 1,000 clicks. "Here is your prize. Here is your living treasure. Here is your reason to burn a farm and write a report that says it was necessary. They made me bait. Kill me, and you save your land." Elias looked up at the crossbeams his wife had carved with wheat lines and star swirls and thought about necessary things. "Or I cut it out," he said softly, not as a boast, but as an option that felt like a stubborn seed in spring. The dragon's nostrils flared. "You're a farmer." "And other things," Elias said, and went to fetch his oldest toolbox, the one that still smelled faintly of a starship. Chapter 2. The Lattice and the Lyre Light. Elias had learned a long time ago there were only two kinds of problems. Those that could be solved if you were patient, and those that could be survived if you were lucky. He laid the toolbox on a bale, took out cloth rolls that had once been white, and were now the color of planets after too much weather, and his hand settled on a device that had rusted with a dignified stubbornness. A Heron coil cutter, obsolete by 3 wars, but still humming when it tasted real work. He thumbed it awake and watched the filament quiver between its tines, a slender ray trembling on the edge of music. The lattice pulsed in answer, like spider silk vibrating in wind. He didn't touch the net, not yet. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the stall, shooed the goats with a quieter voice than he'd brought in, and slid the bolt on the big doors so the next wind wouldn't tell the night what secrets lived here. The dragon tracked him with that steady gaze until Elias found the broken corner of the stall and patched it with an old radiation screen he'd kept because he kept everything that felt like a story. When he turned back, the dragon had collapsed its wings closer, not to hide but to stay compact, like a soldier making room on a crowded transport, and Elias felt something strange and unhelpful tighten behind his ribs. "What do they call you?" he asked, not to be polite, but because names anchor living things to a world that wants to wear them down. "Sarin, in the old shards," the dragon said, and the syllables seemed to taste of river stones and high mountain air. Elias nodded, as if he had expected a name that had weight. He set a palm on the dragon's shoulder, not the net, not the wounds where the scales were whole and cool. "I'm Elias. I grow barley and sheep and parts for machines that don't get made anymore. Once I did other work, but that was a long way away." Sarin's pupils narrowed and widened, and Elias realized he was watching the man's pulse in Elias's throat, the micro-motions of breath and intent. "Old soldier," Sarin said. "Old farmer now," Elias corrected gently, and turned to the lattice. He didn't cut it. He slid the coil cutter along a hair's breadth, felt the net answer with a hiss that wasn't sound but pressure, and thought of the way minds sing through the hull to anyone foolish enough to slide a wrench under their teeth. In another life, he would have called for a jammer, for a smart foam that could freeze a signal like fat on cold stew. But in this barn he had the tools he had and a memory of how the universe lies. "They call it Hunter's Mercy," Elias said, not lifting his eyes, "but it's liar light. It tells nearby ships that salvation is a purchase order away. It tells men like the riders that killing is a service and the receipt is clean." Sarin's slow exhale seemed to make the lamps dim and strengthen. "You know their language," the dragon said. "I know what hungry men can convince each other is lawful," Elias replied. And in the silence that followed, the storm's last tatters drifted down the rafters like the breath of something that had promised to leave and finally kept its word. He improvised, which was all engineering really was when you scratched the paint. He built a Faraday nest out of the old radiation screen, ran salvage battery cable in a loop around the stall, and clipped one end to the barn's metal pillars that went down into honest ground. He called the loop a fence and the fence a prayer. He took the clamp light from the lambing kit and fed it through a resin lens he'd saved from a dead survey drone, so the beam would pick surface currents and leak them into his eyes as colors. The net became a shallow pond under moonlight, ripples tracing to 4 nodes like minnows that had never known a real river. Sarin's breath hitched once when Elias eased the blanket away to the wing joints, and the farmer said, without looking, "If you need to bite me, bite the tool bench, and I'll lend you the good wood." The dragon chuffed, which might have been a laugh if a laugh could carry shame at needing anything. "They put it in me at the gorge," Sarin said, voice steadier now, but with an echo like maps. "They wedged the stake under my breastbone while the tether burned my wing and told me I wouldn't feel it long. They said my kin would come for the beacon, and then they would come for my kin." Elias swallowed once and caught himself looking up at the wheat carvings again the way his thoughts sought his wife's hand on a Sunday out of the old habit of a life that had ended. "They make a man into bait too," he said softly, and it was the only grief he allowed himself in that hour. He brought the coil cutter to the first node, touched it like he would a lamb that had turned wrong in the womb, and shaved the fine loop until the color went from icy green to honest black. The barn held its breath. The node flickered, faltered, and died. A sound rose from the net like a sob that didn't want to disturb the neighbors. "1," Elias said, because counting meant you were still moving forward, and moved to the next. Chapter 3, the riders, and the old song. The first warning was not a siren or a shout from the road, but the way the night changed flavor, as if a tin lid had been put over the valley and the wind didn't know where else to go. Elias felt the pressure before he heard the sound, a high, dry rasp like the edge of a knife on bone. The riders' bikes coming straight down the service track between the barley and the creek, their mufflers tuned to throw the pulse into the earth, so drones would read it as geological tremor. He set the coil cutter down without finishing the third node and switched off the lamp and the lens. Darkness filled the stall like water filling a bowl. Saren's eyes caught the residual light and held it like coals. "They're here," the dragon said, and there was not fear in the words so much as the weariness of someone who had stopped expecting the universe to grant him a day unbothered. Elias moved with the same quiet swiftness with which he had once strapped himself into a rescue cradle while pilots counted backward. He tossed a tarp over the tool bench, wiped with his sleeve where blood had fallen onto the plank, and reached for the old calm bead Talia had hidden in the prayer charm the day she declared they were done running. "Finna," he whispered into a piece of tech older than the mayor's promises. "Put on a kettle and let the steam blow out your north vent. If the riders ask, tell them the pump blew a gasket and you call me to fix it. And take the dogs below." Finna's report back was 3 clicks, the rhythm they had agreed on the night the riders took the Harlows for being too generous with their water. Elias slid the bolt on the barn's man door and stepped into a drizzle of sparks slashed by headlamp beams. He did not put his hands up because a man who did not look afraid could sometimes delay what fear made other men do. 3 riders dismounted, each with the look of boys who had practiced their swagger in broken mirrors until their faces learned it. A 4th stayed on his bike and listened to the field. Their leader's jacket had the pale brand, a sunburst stripped of warmth, and his visor made his eyes 2 round pieces of night. "Evening, old hand," the leader said in the bright voice of a salesman selling forgiveness. "Evening," Elias replied, hearing himself in some other younger place and rejecting it. "You're out late," the rider continued, as if he were remarking on a neighbor's porch light. "We had weather," Elias said. "Animals get frightened. Gates go loose." The 3rd rider, who had the nervous hands of a man who thinks bullets are punctuation, drifted toward the barn doors and sniffed. "Your mill friend says your pump blew," the leader said. Elias let his face offer an apology for the lie he hadn't told. "We'll check the lines," the leader continued. "You know how the prefect worries about water theft." Elias swallowed the sentence that wanted to be born regarding who stole what and when. "Line's clear," he said. "You can ask Fenna. She never liked me enough to lie for me." The leader gave him the kind of smile that said, "You remember how charm works, and I'm counting on it." "One more thing," he said, tilting his head as if to listen to birds. "We caught a beacon up the gorge. Goes quiet near this lot. Strange thing that." Elias didn't let his eyes move. "Strange things like to sit near barns," he said. "Old metal. Ground cables. It's where the sky forgets how to sing." The rider's visor turned, and for a breath the night bent, as if the barn were a thumb pressed into dough. Elias felt Saren behind the wall, felt the dragon's pulse line braided with the diminishing heartbeat of the 2nd node, and knew 2 truths at once. That the 3rd node must be cut now or never, and that if he left the rider looking at the barn too long the man would invent a reason to be brave. He reached into his pocket and drew out something that should have been thrown out years ago, a ship crew dog tag on a ribbon of woven copper, stamped with a service crest and a 4-letter code that had once opened doors in the orbit that made law for places like this. He tossed it underhand like a man who wanted to show off what a keepsake weighed. The leader caught it, reflex entire. It clinked against plastic armor like a real memory tapping a liar's smile. "I used to do work for men who made real beacons," Elias said conversationally, just as the 4th rider took one step toward the edge of the barley where the field sensors ought to have been humming and found them silent. "They taught me how to place false ones too. House cats learn to listen to rattlesnakes and sometimes forget that wind also rattles grass." The leader flipped the tag to his partner, who didn't understand what it was and pretended he did. "You saying you're baiting a trap?" the man asked, trying to sound amused. "I'm saying you probably picked up the mill's boiler vent," Elias said, with just enough scorn to make the man want to prove him wrong by leaving. "Take your fancy meter to the creek. Hear how it sings down the culverts. By the time you come back, the beacon will be gone." The rider's arrogance was a machine that liked to eat time and called it chewing justice. They swung their legs over their bikes, tossed the tag back like a man returns a borrowed nail, and swung out toward the creek, their lamps slicing furrows in the dark. Elias waited until he could no longer hear the bone rasp, then slid inside and picked up the coil cutter. "We have 2 minutes if luck is generous," he said to Sarin. "Luck is a miser," Sarin replied, baring his chest. "But sometimes miser's like a gambler's story." Elias cut the third node and the lattice shivered as if a wind had passed through a grove that wasn't present in this geography. The fourth node brightened in a vain attempt to be important. He turned the cutter, and the barn's lights flickered and confidence turned into work. Chapter 4. What we save, saves us back. The beacon died in a spill of cold that made Elias's teeth ache. For a heartbeat, the barn felt wider, as if the walls had been holding in a horizon and could finally unclench. Sarin sagged without grace and without apology. His blood, darker than a human's, smelled like rain that had fallen on rock heated all day and then been set free. Elias clamped the lines he'd set, wove a new braid with the radiation screen, and slid the whole net into a copper pail the way an old diver coils a rope with hands that know how it remembers twisting. He didn't speak the relief out loud because words sometimes invite eavesdroppers, and besides, he could feel in his cheekbones the returning pulse of the riders' bikes, angry now, thinned like hunger. "They'll come through the doors this time," he said, standing up. "They'll say it's inspection, and then they'll shoot me when I bend to pick up my wrench. They like the story that makes afterward tidy." Sarin crawled to his feet with a fluidity that betrayed how much of his pain he'd kept behind his eyes. "I can fight," the dragon said simply, and the simplicity of it turned Elias's stomach because he'd seen that phrase on too many mouths the day before someone's mother had to pretend the universe respected sacrifice. "You can live," Elias said, just as simply. He moved to the far wall of the barn, put his palm flat against the rough timber, and slid it upward until it hit a bolt he had sunk there when Talia still sang while she worked. The panel swung inward not with a high-security hiss, but with a barn's forgiveness, and behind it lay the guts of a thing he told himself he had kept only for memory, and then admitted he had kept for this. The old engine was not a whole ship, not even a shuttle. It was the throat of a drive, a throat that had learned to drink from the bottom of gravity wells and sing poems to the dark, patched and repatched until it resembled a quilt your grandmother refuses to throw away. "Get in," Elias said. "It isn't flying anywhere, but it remembers how to hum wrong, and wrong hum drives men who worship rules into distraction." They dragged the pail with the lattice into the engine's cavity, wired the dead nodes into the harmonics cradle, and let the machine do what memory lets all old things do when asked nicely. It pretended to be something it had once loved. The engine sang. The lattice answered. The barn became a loophole in the night's ledger. When the riders kicked in the doors, their headlamps painted the stalls into hard measures, and their boots made the music of men who had never built a fence come apart too quickly. "Inspection," the leader bellowed, which, to his credit, he probably believed. "Inspection," Elias echoed in a voice that made the word weigh more than it wanted, and he walked into the light as if stepping onto a stage he hadn't auditioned for. The fourth rider veered right, gun high, toward the lambing stall. His light caught the engine's mouth, the copper pail, the mess of cables, and a man's old toolbox because people always see what they think matters. He did not see Sarin because the engine's hum bent perception like heat does over a road, and his visor software was eating a picture generated by that hum that said barn empty, farmer harmless, evidence technical, and therefore the prefix problem. The leader tried to focus through the noise and snarled, because men who live on rehearsed control do not forgive being made to feel like they have forgotten their lines. "What's that?" he snapped, waving his muzzle in a way that made Elias want to take it away before he hurt someone he hadn't meant to. "Vent stabilizer," Elias said truthfully enough. "I welded it after the storm. If your meter thinks it's a beacon, then you should get your meter a calendar." The leader stepped closer, and for a long second they were two men who had been 12 once, tasked with carrying something heavier than they could lift, and taught to pretend the strain was pride. "If we find anything," the rider said, "and let the threat bloom like mold. You'll write it up neat," Elias said, and didn't lower his eyes. The engine hummed a little louder as Sarin adjusted a phalanx of plates with claws that had learned heart precision to survive a life of iron. The riders' comms squalled, downstream units complaining of false positives from the creek to the mill, 30 beacons, 90, a swarm, a hive. The electronics version of a flock suddenly deciding the sky was a single instruction. The leader swore the way men do when they believe the world owes them clarity, gestured his crew back, and left with the urgency of a dog called to a more interesting scent. The barn watched them go without blinking, the way a barn does when its business is to be still while storms tire themselves out. When the hum wound down and the night remembered how to be the sky, Elias didn't pretend the price had all been paid in cleverness. He fetched water, boiled thistle tea, and cleaned Saren's wounds with hands that had learned long ago how to be both tools and mercy. The dragon spoke in low sentences about mountains and glass lakes, and a gorge that now held the bodies of his sisters the way lakes hold old trees upright forever. Elias spoke of barley, and the fiddle his wife used to make sing when the neighbors drank too much and the moon had to be escorted home. He did not speak of Talia's grave up on the hill where she could watch for storm fronts, nor of the day the riders had come with a writ, and a widow's silence had been more articulate than any protest. They slept like soldiers, Saren half-curled with one eye a half-moon, Elias on a cot. He had told himself he would never again move close to the stall. At dawn he woke to a sound that was not storm or engine or bike. It was the slow, inevitable breathing of a valley making a decision. Finna came first, walking instead of riding, pushing a cart with a basin and a sampler and a basket that smelled like bread when it forgives you. Behind her came Hovel and Pyrie and Mads, and 3 kids Elias had watched build a radio out of a toaster, and the arrogance of youth. And the mill dogs trotted in like a river remembers where to pool in summer. They took in the barn's torn doors, and the way the engine sat like a secret that felt lighter when shared. Elias opened his mouth to say something about risk and law and terror. Pyrie stepped past him and looked straight at Saren the way one looks at a storm one has decided to plant under anyway. "You hungry?" she asked the dragon, and Saren's careful control broke like a good dam into irrigation, and the barn smelled like bread and gratitude. Word went farther than the road commissioner's maps pretended roads did. Travelers who had lost kin to the rider's mercy had stories. Shepherds on the ridge had seen shadows that flew without sound. A tinker who traded in magnets and glass brought an old jammer wrapped in silk and told Elias to pretend he'd always owned it. They built a shelter under the south field where the barley roots held like fingers, reinforced it with culvert rings and salvage paneling, and tuned the engine's hum down to a family's whisper so that future nights would be less frantic and more deliberate. Saren healed without grace and without apology, the way living things do when they discover the world still wants their breath. He kept the blanket, not as a shroud but as a story, and sometimes on afternoons when the wind blew from the ravine, he would lay it over his back and lie in the sun, and the children would make forts under his wing, and the old would pretend not to watch with the soft look that means a wound is knitting. The riders did not stop coming because men like that do not stop until they are embarrassments to their uniforms, but their visits became thinner as the false beacons multiplied, and the valley learned to move like a single animal. Finna's steam vents, Mads's culvert choruses, the kid's toaster transmitter that told the creek to sing in modulated laughter. Twice they brought a writ with more seals than sense. Twice the prefect's cousin came personally with a drone as gray as an apology and asked whether Elias had anything to declare. "Yes," Elias said the second time, and unfolded the old tag he'd shown the leader, polished now because truth likes to be tended. "I declare that if you continue to hunt what can speak for itself in a county that has nothing else left to barter but its own decency, you will find that our patience has a perimeter and that we know how to wire it without calling it a fence." The cousin put her hand on the drone's cool head and, to her credit, let her eyes show that she understood, which is not the same as agreeing, but is the opening of a door in a world that likes to brick things up. In the autumn the valley held a harvest feast, not because the barley had been more generous, but because survival had, and Elias brought out Talia's fiddle and held it, as if it were a bridge over a river he still feared, but finally wanted to cross. Saren lay beyond the firelight where the sparks would not tempt his wounds to remember too vividly, and the children draped the old blanket over his back like a cloak of office. Elias tuned the fiddle, thought of the years between this moment and the last time he'd drawn the bow, and played an old Spacer's song that had piloted him home more than once, when home was a coordinate string and a promise he had made to a woman whose laugh could turn an engine room into a chapel. The dragon's head lifted. A second tone wove under the fiddle's line, low and molten and threaded with a canyon's echo. And for a tremulous measure, barn and barley and creek and human and dragon and all the stitched-up scars between them were a single instrument the size of a valley. And the decibel meter in the prefect's office 40 miles away wrote a number on a screen that meant nothing to the man drinking lukewarm coffee beside it, and everything to anyone who had learned to listen. When the song loosened to silence, Sauron spoke without lifting his head. "Where I am from," he said, "we believed you must pay for what you keep alive. Not with coin. With the work of making a place where the thing can be what it is without apologizing. You have paid for me. I will pay for you." It was an oath without a flourish, and no paper in the county could have held it firmer. Elias set the fiddle down before his hands could show what his face would not, and he went to the dragon and laid a palm on the old blanket and felt in the weave the grit and sweat of every night the barn had been a church. Years after the first storm, spring came with a bluntness that made Elias's joints ache, and with it a rumor that the prefect had lost his office to a woman who kept bees and books in equal number. The riders had taken their bone-rasp bikes and their lyre-like contracts and gone north where men were still willing to call cruelty an industry. The valley's machines hummed at reasonable volumes. The mill's ledger matched what had actually been ground and not what bribes could convince ink to say. The children who had built the toaster radio graduated to building a repeater on the ridge, and through it, in winter, sometimes, you could hear other valleys speaking the way old friends speak around a kitchen table in a language that requires no translation. Sauron's scars silvered. The wing that would never again take a mountain from the air took it from the ground instead, step by step, and there was a rock at the top where he liked to lie and watch the world he had survived decide to keep itself. Elias kept farming because nothing better had been invented than food, and he kept mending because things that do their jobs deserve to be brought back when they break. On the anniversary of the night the blanket had been a shroud, and then a banner, Elias carried up the hill a bottle of the harsh brandy Talia used to pour in thimbles so it would last through the winter, and he poured a thimble on the dirt by her stone, and a thimble on the engine's old casing, and a thimble on the copper pail, and he drank a thimble and coughed the way a man coughs when his body is reminded it is still a body. Sauron came up behind him without silence because friends don't need to sneak. "I have been thinking," the dragon said, "the way people say I am about to bring you a gift you did not know you wanted. We should build a place for those who come hurt as I came. Not only a barn, a school for mending, a craft." Elias looked out over barley that looked back and the creek that remembered their trick and the road that had learned new stories, and he nodded because some plans are merely the future remembering itself. "We'll need stone," he said, already counting what the ridge could spare without resenting it. "And a roof that sings wrong to the meters," Sauron added, amused. "And blankets," Elias said, and they both smiled with the kind of grief that is not weakness but a mapping. They built it by seasons, laying foundation in spring when ground forgives shovels, raising walls in summer when friends can be bribed with cold cider, fitting doors in autumn when wood decides what shape it wants to keep through winter, and telling the building to hold through storms, as if buildings listen, which of course they do. The first to come was not a dragon but a kid from the ridge whose arm had been caught in a baler because haste had felt like virtue. Elias taught him that patience is the only tool that never goes blunt. The second was a hawk with a tuft of transmitter wire tangled around its leg, which Sauron snipped with one claw, and then held the bird gently until it remembered the sky wasn't a theory. In the third winter, a dragon came bearing a scar that had the exact geometry of a rider's hand, and she stayed for 3 days, and then for 3 months, and then for a year, and on the night she left, she laid one angular scale by the door, a coin, a sentence, a signature, and when spring came her shadow passed over the barley, and the lambs didn't bolt because the valley had learned to tell the difference between a hunter and a neighbor. Elias grew older the way men grow older who stay interested in things. Sauron grew larger in ways that had nothing to do with size. They argued like brothers about how much to charge for gaskets and how to best reflect a false beacon off the creek in the new season when the riders sometimes tried again with better software. They laughed like men who have been hungry and now have a pantry and the humility to know what luck and work had to do with it. On a summer evening that had polished itself to a bronze like the inside of a bell, a young woman came up the road with a satchel that had been patched so beautifully it might as well have been new, and she asked the question in the old form because she had been taught by someone who cared about forms. Does this valley offer mercy? Elias thought of the first night, of a blanket and a net and a voice that had said just kill me, and had not meant only I am tired, but also I am dangerous if left in the world, as men have remade me. He looked at Sarin, who adjusted the blanket on his back not out of need, but because it felt good to carry the proof of a beginning in a way that didn't ask anyone to applaud. No, Elias said, and the girl's face fell until he added, we offer mending. Mercy is what powerful men call it when they want to look generous while they remove their problem. Mending is work. It makes you part of the next storm solution. The girl smiled then, and in the angle of her teeth and the tilt of her head he saw, with a start, a flash of Talia in a way that didn't hurt. Sarin leaned down, eye level with the newcomer, and said, we will teach you how to cut liar light out of good flesh. We will teach you how to listen to engines, and to birds, and to your own pulse. We will teach you how to build a fence that is a prayer and a prayer that is a fence. And we will ask you what song you brought from wherever you came. Because songs are bridges, and we plan to keep building. The girl nodded and stepped under the lintel, and the school took her in because that's what it had been built to do. In the years that followed, people from beyond the ridge began to tell a story whose details mangled themselves on long roads, but whose marrow stayed true. That in a valley where barley grew stubborn and the creek could be talked into laughter, a farmer had opened a blanket and staggered back in horror, not at a monster, but at the thing men had done to a living being to make their job easier. And that the farmer and the dragon had decided, with the kind of calm that tells storms they are not invited inside, to make a different job for themselves, to remove nets, to bend meters towards silence, to teach hands new work, and to let breath stay where it belonged. When the prefect's successor brought her bees to the valley one spring to show, she meant what she had written in her first decree. She stood in the school's doorway and put her palm to the lintel and did not speak, because there are places where language is a guest and should take its boots off. Sarin blinked his molten eyes, and Elias found that the ache in his knuckles and the ache behind his breastbone were finally the same ache, the one a man earns by living long enough to make, unmake, and remake a world in a small compass. On the last night of a winter that had been hard only in the honest ways, thunder walked the ridge without needing lightning, and Elias woke with the old counting between flash and report on his tongue. He went to the barn because that is where he had always gone when the sky grumbled, and he took the blanket down and shook it out, and for a moment the dust of a dozen seasons made a galaxy in the clamplight. Sarin came and lowered his head, and Elias threw the blanket over that old scarred back, not because he needed to, but because ritual is a language that says I remember, and Sarin said, just kill me, in a dry imitation of his own voice the first night, and Elias laughed, the laugh that had been coyotes and grief for too long, and was finally allowed to be a man's bark of joy. Not tonight, he said, and then, with the careful seriousness people reserve for things that deserve it, not ever. The thunder went its way, the barn settled, the engine hummed a lullaby it had learned from the creek, and at the door the wind paused like someone who has been well hosted and wants to thank the house before stepping into the dark. In the morning, the barley wore frost at the edges the way a saint wears a thin gilt in old paintings, and the world asked, as it does every day from the beginning, whether those who wake to it will keep it alive. The valley, being wise in the ways of work, answered by doing the work. And the farmer and the dragon, having chosen mending over mercy, kept their hands warm by keeping others whole.